Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar today. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm, and this webinar today is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series that is presented jointly by Black Swan Solutions and Firestorm. You can go to firestorm.com and you can watch previous webinars that have been recorded, and you can register for future webinars in this series. We're delighted to have our friends Black Swan as the co-host and sponsor of this webinar series. Michelle, would you like to say some nice things about Black Swan?
So you want me to talk about myself?
To talk about, yes.
Well, Black Swan, we help organizations respond to and support the people impacted in a crisis. So we're glad that people are able to join us to, learn about, when we present and talk about these different topics, it's all coming from experiences and different events that we've assisted with and supported so that other businesses can take those lessons to best apply them to their own individual organization so that if they ever run into a situation, they can utilize that so they hopefully don't run into the same challenges others have.
Good.
And this is Jim jumping in, and one of the things that I think is going to be exciting about today are to talk about the compliance communications that are so critical in a cyber breach. And Michelle's going to be sharing with us some unique insights around the events that they've supported. So, Bill, let's get back on and we can talk about Firestorm.
Right.
Or would you like me to?
We'll give the advertisement for Firestorm. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage your risk and crises. Firestorm's expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. You can become our friend, Facebook, Firestorm Solutions, Twitter, Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. I'd like to remind you, though, the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product presented must be read and considered in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. In addition, do not interpret this information in the comments made as legal advice or legal opinion. Today we're going to be talking about cyber attack, the human impact lessons. This is a very important thing and a very timely subject that we're going to be discussing. Cyber attack is increasing in intensity. Our presenters today, and you've been introduced briefly to them, Michelle Colosimo, she's with Black Swan Solutions and Director, and our very own Jim Satterfield, who is the President, Chief Operating Officer, and founder of Firestorm. Jim, Michelle, over to you, please.
We're excited today to be back together and talking about these subjects, and I think Michelle's insights from dealing with the human impact related to these events. We can't pick up the newspaper today without seeing and hearing about a cyber breach and knowing what was said and what was done. We're going to cover some different topics today to try to framework a little bit of what you need to do to be prepared, and then go in behind the scenes and look at some of these details around that compliance communications. This is the third in the webinar series, and we talked about bad things happening and what happens from a communication standpoint there, then different communications breakdowns, and then finally today the focus on the cyber attack and the human impact lesson. We've had several hundred people going through the webinar series, and so thank you for the time and thank you for what you're doing in your companies as we focused on those. I think that today you're in to see something fairly unique, and it's the type of thing that you need to think about now, not on the day when that breach occurs. The FBI divides companies into two categories: those companies that know they have had a cyber breach and those that have had a cyber breach and don't know it. And it's a lesson for all of us across as we look into these areas. I'd like you to keep in mind, before we get into the lessons, that cybersecurity is a business issue, not an IT issue. Now, we could have said it's not just an IT issue because clearly something's happened and information has gone out the door, But the key emphasis here is the business impact. This is a business issue, and those that are on the phone today from a business continuity and a crisis management perspective, that's what we need to continue to take a focus on. The breaches are as a result of people, not just someone coming in. It's people not following protocols, clicking on that attachment that they shouldn't have, downloading some information. Where you should start in this is identifying your crown jewels. What are the critical information assets within your company? If we looked a couple of decades ago, the assets were physical within corporations. Today, 80% of the assets in a company are informationally oriented. So in addition to those important things that are very critical to us, what other records might someone want? Why would they want them? And does our senior management and board and employees understand the situational awareness around this, the indicators that they should be looking for, what's our strategy and our operations, is there an incident response plan, and have we laid out a crisis communications plan with the message maps? And I believe, Michelle, you're going to share with us some more details around that. And there's a lot of statistics here. Michelle, do you want to comment on any of these statistics?
Sure. I think it's so important when we look at this topic, and as you discussed, they're happening. These events are happening more often than we expect, and so this is kind of on the radar for lots of businesses. And looking at the stats that are out there, I think this proves why. In the United States, we really have the most costly data breaches as well as the greatest number of exposed or compromised records. On average, it's about 29,000 records, which is a lot. What I thought was a very shocking statistic is how long a breach can go undetected. And they say an average of 240 days. And put that in the context, taking a different analogy and thinking about that, what if you're in your home, everybody has a kitchen sink, owns a kitchen sink, and if that kitchen sink had a leak in it for 240 days, and a bad leak that you didn't know about, think about all of the damage that had been done by the time you discover it. So that concern about not knowing and not knowing for a long time has also negative implications for the business. In addition to that, when you look at what are those top industries that are targeted, the top three are obviously pharmaceutical, financial, and healthcare, and a lot of that has to do with the more sensitive and confidential information that they have. But then even look at retail, though it's on the smaller side of those that have been impacted, they've had the most catastrophic breaches, so the most costly. And I think this is just really important information to look at. When you look at that cost, then you break it down by record. In the United States, each stolen record costs on average $201. And there are factors that either increase or decrease the cost of the breach. So from the higher end, it could be third-party involvement in the breach or notifying people too quickly. That's going to create higher costs for you in responding to it versus the flip side of it that helps reduce the cost, and is what you were talking about, Jim, is having an incident response plan in place, having an appointed chief information security officer and strong security. That's going to impact what those numbers are going to look like. And I think what's most important is this is average. So can you imagine if you're on the high end of that, what those costs look like? In addition, just some additional, I think, interesting facts is 62% of businesses learned not from their breach on their own, but actually from their customers. And in addition to that, 57% of retailers said the supplier, so the vendor they worked with, was actually liable for the breach. And last but not least, which I think also is really interesting, is 2 or 3 victims who were the victim of identity theft and were informed about it, did nothing about it. So think about those vulnerabilities that are in place.
And before we jump off the slide, just one other observation here. You can be a small company, but given the nature of the data within your company, it could still be a major breach. It could be a significant number. So the size of your company isn't a function of the size of the breach as we look in those areas.
Absolutely.
Obviously, as we look at coming from the inside, the human error elements associated with it, and we gave you a list of things to think about at the beginning about identifying those information assets But look at those two questions here. What information and secrets are you protecting, and who are the actors that would want them? Knowing what you're going to do and say before anything happens becomes critical. Michelle, I know you wanted to make some other points here too.
Well, I think actually, once we get into the lessons learned, this will make that point about just knowing what to do or say before it happens is so critical in once you are actually having to respond to that cyber attack. Preparedness is key.
And looks like there's a lot of data here about these breaches.
Well, and this is just, we all are aware of those large business data breaches that have happened over the last couple of years. And so I think it's just, again, a good reminder to look at those numbers and look at the number of people impacted. You're talking millions. And if you start to calculate that out per cost of record, it's a lot of money.
Yeah, we find in a cyber breach, and this would really hold true across other types of crisis management, there are 3 C's of crisis communication. So all of your communications fall into one of these 3 buckets. And I think that's going to become very important as you listen to Michelle today and get an insight into what it's like with the call center and providing support. The first large bucket is that of coordination, where your communications are directed internally to coordinate all the activities regarding the cyber breach response and recovery. And the key is to make sure that you have a response plan in place. The second categorization is those communications that relate to your brand and your reputation. Those are the crisis communications where those are external. And the last is the compliance communications that you would do. Those are related to the people that have been impacted. It's been their PII and their PHI that's been stolen, and you have requirements that vary by state and by regulator. So the state would be looking at this from a cyber breach standpoint. Different industry segments would be looking at it. If you're a financial institution, it could be the FFIEC, the Federal Reserve, or other categories, or your state banking regulators. If you're a public company, there could be SEC requirements. If you're regulated by other sectors, those would come in. Now, when Michelle talks today about lessons learned, a lot of her communications will be focused on this compliance area. But if you help your management team focus their communications into these 3 different groups, it will be a way for you to better control the communication. Was this a coordination communication? Was it a crisis communication? Or was it a compliance? And in addition to planning what those messages are, you have to plan when those messages will be distributed, and that's going to be critical that you include your executive management into the timing of those releases. Cyber breach in particular is not one that you want to think about, well, we'll wing it and figure out when it occurs, is not going to be a winning plan associated with it. So what we want to do is to, and we've asked Black Swan today, and Michelle in particular, to come and share some of the lessons learned. We're going to go through those lessons before the attack occurs, and then we're going to go through some lessons that come after the attack occurs. And I think as you listen to Michelle today, it's going to fall into one of these 3 areas. Is it something around predict, something around plan, or something around perform? Is it understanding the vulnerabilities and threats and their impacts and the triggering and the monitoring? Is it the planning that needs to go into place? Or is it actually the performing of it, delivering the messages, training and testing associated with it? So, Michelle, let's go into that first area if we could. Talk a little bit about this area.
Sure, I appreciate that, Jim, and it speaks to what you were just talking about in relation to that compliance piece. In helping assist and respond to businesses that have been impacted by a cyber breach, it's really important, or a cyber attack, when you're looking at it ahead of time, to truly understand your state regulations. And going beyond that on how notification should be conducted, who needs to be notified, and there's a timing aspect of when that notification needs to occur. And as you talked about, if you don't know those things ahead of time, when you're in the middle of it, there's things that can be missed. When we've assisted businesses in response to this, one of those gaps or those areas where, that it gets a little more convoluted is they had members that were deceased, yet their beneficiary was still alive. And so there were requirements around notifying the beneficiary, but they didn't catch that right away. And then you still have those timing implications. So, being aware, and especially where you're located, your states are, and where you work or your business works out of, understanding all those different states, because a lot of them are very unique or have their own different components to it. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
And if your customers are in multiple states, then you're regulated by all those states, and we find different definitions of what personal identifiable information is on a state-by-state differentiation, or PHI, public personal health information. So this is it's not something that's simple. It's very complex. What about roles and teams?
Well, this is really key as well. Obviously, when you look at your crisis management team, it's in who plays what role when something happens, and especially a cyber attack or breach. Each piece or each player has something to contribute. And if you're not aware of who's responsible for what prior to, it can become detrimental at the time of the breach, because now some other teams might be taking on responsibilities that they yet don't necessarily have knowledge of or weren't prepared for, that now are making it more complicated for that business to respond, because you didn't have the right team or players in the right place ahead of time and knowing who has access to what and who's responsible for what. So clearly defining that ahead of time and knowing who's going to be doing what and who needs to be involved when that a breach occurs is really, really key.
Okay, and it seems like that obviously not only knowing, but testing it with those folks. You would recommend that too, I assume.
Absolutely. It's one thing to write down, who's assigned to what and what their responsibilities are, but it's another thing that those individuals understand what their responsibilities are, and that the other teams understand that as well, and that they actually communicate in practice so that they see how that unfolds and what contributing factors come into play.
Well, Black Swan was a critical vendor for these firms that were experiencing cyber breach. Talk a little bit about the collaboration process there.
Yeah, that collaboration is key. You think about it as, hey, it's kind of like that same thing with your plan on the shelf. I'll pull it out when something happens. Well, what happens when you do that? There's problems with that because it hasn't been looked at. People don't know what to do. The same thing goes when you're talking with your vendor partners. If you don't talk with them ahead of time and understand what it is that they can do for you and what they can't do for you, as well as how are those communications going to go back and forth, and how are you going to continue throughout the evolution of that event, can work with each other, it's going to be problematic at the time, because you're going to run into roadblocks without knowing who those points of contact are, or again, what the extent of it is that your vendor can do for you. So if you clarify that ahead of time, you make sure people are aware, and even how do you activate the services, or how is that coordinated, and then test it and drill it. It makes you so much more confident, as well as makes that response go much more smoothly.
So if you've done that, your ability to stand the call center up quickly is greatly accelerated.
Absolutely.
Okay, now let's shift over and think about afterwards. So what do you do after it occurs? Should we wait, or should we get you involved soon?
Sure. Well, obviously getting us involved soon is important, because we can help provide some guidance, as well as, get things in place to be able to respond most appropriately to those that are impacted. But in addition to that, it's also internally. Yes, you've got to be careful about how many people internally you make aware of this before the actual notice goes out. But at the same time, there are still key teams that you have to have involved, especially those, the heads of those teams that has access to some of that information that might have been compromised, because they know that data best, and they're able to best give further information about how that information is collected, how far it goes back, what information is collected. so that you can think through when you're looking at that ripple effect, those that are impacted, how much further it goes beyond that. It helps you better prepare and be able to respond and continue to stay in those communications so you're appropriately staying on top of it.
Talk about the messaging, and what's this concept about being cautious?
Well, I think we all want to be careful in what we say and how we say it, but there's a tendency then to spend a lot of time on crafting that message and having several people review that message before it gets finalized. And when that happens, obviously that's time delay, and that can have further implications. One of the responses we responded to, they not only had their members, their customers impacted, but they also had their own people, their employees impacted. And they were doing a really good effort at making sure their employees got a personal touch and got their hands held through the process, and so they wanted to send out a specific notification to them and putting some support in place. Yet they had so many people looking at it and taking their time kind of walking through with a fine-tooth comb that there was a delay in when that letter actually went out again, and that created more confusion for those people that they were trying to provide support to. So it's good to make sure you're putting out the right message, but also be careful to not spend too much time or have too many cooks in the kitchen in relation to crafting that message.
And having those messages pre-written so that you can edit them instead of having to take scratch becomes a big difference. And having all the parties sign off on them in advance so that it's gone through legal and you've gotten the peer review that you're looking for internally in the organization.
Correct, and you kind of know then where it's at, right? Where it's stuck at, so you can push that a little bit more.
And it leads us right, I guess, into the message maps and the FAQs.
Yeah, absolutely. You will have your initial FAQs based off of what you can expect that people are going to want to know, and there's just things already you can think of. However, as you start to hear from people that were potentially impacted, you have to be able to then grow or build upon that frequently asked questions document. It's not going to be set in stone. There's going to be questions that are going to arise that you may have not yet been prepared for, and so building that document and staying on top of that's going to help in your own people responding to those people that are impacted, as well as your vendors that are supporting you. The other key piece about that too is, again, when we get to this whole idea of messaging and crafting the right message to the right audience, sometimes that can get troubling too because you have too many documents, too many frequently asked questions, and that can create inconsistency and more confusion, and you want to stay away from that. As much as you can have a universal frequently asked questions that get updated regularly, the better, versus having multiple iterations of it.
So having a chain of command helps?
Absolutely. Chain of command is important. And the thing that you're going to have to realize is whether you have a call center or you're using your own resources to handle the calls associated with those people that were impacted, you're still going to have events that need to be escalated. You're going to have people who just are not accepting what they're hearing or who want more information specific to what it is you had on file for them, that you need to make sure you have go-to people that are the point people for your vendors to go to or your internal staff to go to say, hey, we have the situation that needs to get escalated and somebody needs to follow up on, and here's the details pertaining to that, so that also there's a timely response back to that individual. Because if you have somebody that's agitated and you take a long time then in getting back to them, that can create some more trouble. Then too, when you think about communication, and really if you look at all the lessons that we're talking about, it focuses. Communication is key. Is you also have to communicate with your vendors as that event is unfolding. Otherwise, if we're behind the 8 ball in relation to additional, say, notifications you put out or additional information you put out, it makes us look like we're not caught up, and that doesn't help that business look responsive and can impact that reputation. So if you have a change occurring or you have something going out or information needs or new changes being updated, it's so imperative that whomever else you have helping in response to that, that they stay apprised and are on that same level of communication to the rest of those in the organization that need to know about that.
And I think to stop here just for a minute and think about this, to the person who's dealing with this problem, and every crisis is a human crisis, it's their family that's been impacted. It's their information, their data, their credit, all of those elements that are moving from that standpoint. And so they're going to be dealing with it very, very personally, and they're going to view the vendor, they're going to view the call center as the company. They're not going to view it as some vendor that's been out. It's an extension of your brand and your company when you bring in a call center. The fact that Black Swan is staffed with people that understand the emotion and trauma that someone's going through in this particular point in time. It's not a call center like you're just calling to confirm an appointment on Tuesday, and that's one skill level. The types of individuals that you really need here are people that have that recognition, have that training, have that skill set to be empathetic, and then to understand the significance. Also to understand when that question comes in, wait a minute, this is something new, and we need to escalate it. And if you put that group in a position where they're surprised, and you've heard me say in many of the Firestorm webinars that the last time a surprise was good, I was 5 and it was my birthday. As you think about that, these are the people that are your face to your customer or your employee, because if it's a cyber breach, it's your employee, and the morale factor of having your employees in it are just, it's very, very significant. So it looks like it has to continually be adjusted.
It does. Well, and that's such the, the key piece that you were talking about. I think sometimes people think it's a cyber breach, it's a cyber attack, it's just their personal information. They weren't emotionally impacted by this event. And you would be surprised, the responses that these people have when they find out that they potentially, their information might have been exposed. And the reason being is because it can go deeper than just that information. You can have people calling in that maybe the information was in relation to their spouse who just passed away. So their person is having an emotional reaction to what's just happened, and you need to meet them where they're at. Some, you have a great script put together and are just reading off the script, and there in itself can just make that conversation go cold and make the perception of that person that's calling in, feel like they're not being listened to. So it's so important to connect with that person that's calling in, understand what they're wanting to know, and finding out what they need versus just following a script that you want to get through to make sure they get, all the details pertaining to what has happened. So you got to balance that. This goes, and Jim, you talked about this a little bit ago, when you have so many documents floating around that need to be reviewed or looked at, it's so important to have a centralized location for these documents to be sitting in, so you know who touched it last, when was the last time it was revised, who revised it, kind of where did it go through that chain, because if you don't have that, then there's problems in relation to people updating the wrong version or making changes off of the wrong document, and so that delays, again, getting those frequent updates out in a timely fashion because of that. And people think, well, that's not such a big deal. How do people miss that? But it's so easy to do because you're in the rigmarole of everything else going on. So this is such a simple thing, but make sure you have this ahead of time, knowing where is this information going to be stored that your people are going to be needing to look at and go into to be able to review and update and sign off on.
We're working with Black Swan now on another program in another space, not the cyber area. And the concept of a central repository of being able to maintain what did you know and when did you know it. In a cyber breach, there will be litigation. And so to know what the scripts were, what was said, where did the information come from, that you're communicating, that chain will be extremely important. not the least of which is making sure we get the right message to the right person at the right time. And so having a formalized structure that maintains the process, maintains those documents, because this is not going to start one day and finish the next. This is a continuum over time as people become involved.
Absolutely. You know, and the other thing too is, you know, you have people involved, right, internally in the organization that have to make decisions, that have to respond and get things going. And you have to remember, you know, you can't be worried about hurting somebody's feelings when you're trying to respond to this event. You have to focus on the impact of the organization and make decisions based off of that, rather than whose feelings I'm going to hurt if they're aware of this or if I decide to make this decision. It's so important that during these times you can't make decisions on how you feel. It's on what's best and for the business as well as the customers in relation to how you're responding to it.
And I think that presentation that you just said here comes back to emphasizing this is a business crisis. It's not an IT crisis. This is a business crisis, and this really drives that issue home as we focus on it. And obviously, as we talked about, every crisis is a human crisis. Talk about the impact if it's your employees and their data has been stolen.
Well, you know, and that's the big thing is sometimes we get so focused on our customers, which is important. You know, we don't want our customers were impacted. That can impact our business and how they, you know, respond to how we've handled it. But at the same time, your employees could also be part of that same impact. And in fact, in some of the activations that we've responded to, there was more information that was exposed for the employees because they have checking information on file than the customers. And so you got to remember that they're impacted as well, and they're dealing with their own personal reactions to it as well as having to deal with the response from the customers. And so you've got to make sure to walk that fine line in making sure, yes, you're supporting the external people, but at the same time putting things in place for the internal people so that they're also feeling like they're being treated properly and respectfully, in addition to having to continue to run that place of employment or run that business.
We just have been doing a series of engagements around cyber breach, and we do, where we're getting people engaged in understanding what they need to do within the organization, have done a questionnaire and a survey, and it was interesting that in some of the companies, if a customer's data is taken, it seemed to be more severe in the mind of the company than if their own employees' data was taken, and actually they both should be at very high level. There shouldn't be that kind of differential, and so losing sight of that can be a trap to come in. And it looks like we kind of ought to think about who this is that we're talking to when we're having those calls.
Right. You know, again, it goes back to, you know, you got to be empathetic. You got to be compassionate. You got to be understanding. Don't minimize, you know, what somebody's gone through. Meet them where they're at, and that's going to go a long way in relation to the perception and how people felt the incident was handled. You can't take back what just happened, but how you treat those that were impacted will have a determination on the impact of the reputation for that business.
All right, so it kind of brings us back to where we started as we set this in play. If you are thinking about preparing to deal with cyber risk and then ultimately a cyber breach involved, and we'll be doing more webinars around this topic, particularly over the next 90 days, and I'll share some insights into that in just a few minutes. Predicting what your critical data and information is, the crown jewels, those information assets, the intellectual property, looking at that also not only in terms of data and information, but your infrastructure, your hardware, your networks, your software, your applications, the human element. We've really stressed today that it's going to be that human error, clicking on that attachment that they shouldn't. Jack Healy, who is our EVP involved in the area of managing in identifying business crisis risk was on the call. He'd tell a story about missile command, and he was at a conference, and the head of missile command, and you think about all our missiles and the defense structure that we would have in place, and he said, I have literally rocket scientists working for me, and I can't get them not to click on the attachments. And if I can't do it with rocket scientists, how do you hope to be able to have the people in your company? So predicting where the problems will come in, developing a plan, making sure that you know what the response is at each one of the 5 stages of a crisis: the pre-action, the onset, the impact assessment, the response and recovery, and ultimately the post-recovery, where we're dealing with the consequence management. Then the performing, the training. Do your people know the indicators? Do they understand what to look for? Do you have an activation matrix that says this is the point in which we act? Is there a detailed roadmap with checklists that you can look at each point along the way, and have we tested that, and have we trained on those areas? Are we monitoring? Do we have an intelligence network that lets us know what's going on within those areas? And have we practiced getting the approval on our messages and updating and crafting those, and then managing the crisis? The why are we communicating? Is it that this communication must go out because it's a coordination one? We've got to get all of our people in to say we're going to do training on what you can say and what you can't say, of how we respond, of what tests, what forensics, the chain of command, the other elements that are involved. Is this a communication that's external? Is it involving the crisis where we have to make a statement? We saw today the resignation of the CEO of Volkswagen over the problem with the diesel engines and the calibration and emissions test. And these types of crises, cyber breach, are ones that will reach back into the C-suite. And if you look at the corporations that have had major breaches, you've seen the CEO and the CIO or the CISO all lose their jobs over these types of events. So what those messages are that relate to your brand are extremely important. And as we talk about visibility, it creates vulnerability. If your company is in the news, that high visibility creates its own vulnerability as we carry forward. And then last is this communications around compliance. We have to get this message out to these people because it's their data, it's their information that's at risk and coming together. If you'll take a look at your crisis communications, place them in those 3 areas, write those messages out, establish the criteria, but remember, don't hit the send button until executive management is comfortable with that message going out at that time. Then what we're looking at, what it is that you're going to say and when you're going to do it as we come together. This all ties back into the predict, plan, perform. So I think we all want to know what's going to happen tomorrow. Do you want to know that? I know if I could, I'd buy the right stock, or I'd do the right action, or I'd make sure that we have the right things in place. And can your people afford not to know at that point? So if you haven't gone through this process, if you haven't done the types of things that you've heard from Michelle today, that you're going to see that there's a vulnerability within your organization that you want to go ahead and remedy. So I would encourage you to align your communications or plans to the best practices. There are clear best practices out there. In another webinar, we'll talk about a cyber breach response maturity model, sharing some of the details around that. And I think Michelle's done a good job today of outlining those communications things that you should think about. Last month, we did a virtual exercise to allow crisis management teams to experience what it was like to make a decision in a crisis, and we had 318 companies doing that. We are going to run a cyber breach virtual exercise based upon the feedback that we had from that event, and that's coming up in December. We'll be announcing that very shortly, and I would encourage you, this is a great opportunity to bring your business people and your crisis management team and your IT team together along with your communication specialist, because we're going to go through a cyber breach and allow your team team to make those critical decisions, and that's coming up early in December. Create your own intelligence network. If you're going to find that the comment repeatedly in this area is that in many, many cases you learn about the breach from external sources. So if there was a problem that was going on and people are talking about that on social media, you need to have that information coming into your organization. Or, and the last would be to schedule training around this. This is not business as usual, it's business as unusual. So, Michelle, before we move on, let's stop for a minute and see if there's anything else that you want to share with our listeners today about what they need to be focused on here.
You know, I think we've covered it, and really the key out of this is you can't not plan for this. You know, you have to, with this day and age, with technology, and as you talked about, you know, the assets being information, you got to have a plan in place and be prepared, because your plan is going to impact, you know, those costs associated with these events, and making sure you've got your relationships established ahead of time and knowing who's doing what and how those things are going to unfold is going to be key to the success of your response.
Yeah, this is, of all of the crises, and I think they all share this in common, but this one in particular, this is not a last-minute crisis. This is not something that, well, we'll just come together just in time and make it all work. This is a predictable event, and you need to have your plans and your training and your testing all in line so that you're prepared to respond. So our thanks go to Black Swan and Michelle in particular for being with us today and dealing with call centers and communications and compliance communications around a cyber breach, and any of those other areas. I would encourage you to reach out to them. The phone number there is 888-723-2466, and the website blackswancrisissolutions.com. A wealth of information there, and certainly assistance when you need it. If you've got questions for us, drop us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or go to our website at firestorm.com, and you can complete a contact form. You can also go there and you'll see probably posted by the end of the week or by early next, the date of the virtual cyber exercise coming up in December, along with all the other webinars that you can participate in. Or you can pick up the phone and give us a call at 800-321-2219. So we'd like to give you back your afternoon. Thank you for joining us today and talking about the lessons learned, the human impact, and particularly around the crisis communications requirements in a cyber breach. Unfortunately, the challenge that's going to impact each and every one of our businesses, we need to be prepared to deal with these types of elements, and the time to begin that preparation is today. Not tomorrow, not next month, or I'll put it in the budget for next year. The exposure is large. It doesn't matter whether you're a big company or a small company. The exercise we did the other day with a client based on their business model was a $600 million impact. I don't know about you. I don't think my budget has that worked into it as just a rounding error. I think that we're talking about events that are truly catastrophic. So whether it's a Category 5 hurricane, a cyber breach can easily be a Category 5. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and look forward to talking with you on the next webinar. Or if you're going to be in San Diego for the Disaster Recovery Conference, we're doing a cyber breach workshop and exercise on Sunday at the DRJ. So please come by and see us or stop by our booth. We'll be glad to review your plan. Black Swan will be there also. You can stop by their booth at the DRJ and get a chance to meet Michelle and talk to the team there too. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.